Our curated series this semester is entitled Building Affinities. Affinities connotes a natural attraction to a person, place, thing, or idea. This lecture series explores the intimate attractions among architecture, people, and the expanded environment. What affinities might we have for our buildings, and how can we build new affinities and affinity groups through empathic, entangled architectural production that cultivates a shared sense of belonging? Last week we kicked off our series with Brandon Clifford, and I want to just give you a little preview of some events to come in this series in the coming weeks, including Deborah Garcia, who will amplify the overlaps of architecture and sound design to initiate a pulsing participatory party. Lola Shepard, who champions the role of architecture in rural and remote territories, where considerations of environment, geography, colonization, and degrowth become entangled. Andres Kaka, who enacts the politics of architecture that is breathed, sweated, swallowed, digested, and climatized. Matt Stride, who embraces structure to inform memorable architectural expression. And I also want to encourage you to visit our new exhibition, Contextualizing Africa, which is open now in the TBH Atrium. The exhibition, which coincides with Black History Month, is curated by Isabel Ndumi, also an alum of our program, and features the work of 10 architectural firms hailing from 9 African countries. The exhibition features over 30 distinct projects and aims to challenge and dispel the prevailing misconception that Africa is a homogeneous entity. By presenting a rich tapestry of designs and structures, the exhibition invites you to engage in a thoughtful conversation that transcends borders and explores the unique and varied narratives embedded in each project. I strongly encourage you to join us on Wednesday over lunch, as Isabel will be here in person to unpack themes and threads of inquiry from the exhibition. So that's this Wednesday from 12 to 1 p.m. So now it is my delight and pleasure to invite our director and ACSA Distinguished Professor, Francisco Rodriguez, to introduce the PLIM Professorship, its significance, and tonight's amazing speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joseph. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all here in PLIM Auditorium. We have some special guests tonight. We have Dean Hamilton joining us for the lecture. Welcome to PLIM Auditorium. PLIM Auditorium for the PLIM lecture. The PLIM Professorship is a distinguished visiting professorship conferred upon an internationally or nationally renowned architect, in this case, Wanda de la Costa. As PLIM professors, recently we have had architects like Ellen Dunham Jones last semester. You saw her lecture. Solano Benitez from Latin America. We had Mark Raymond, who came from Johannesburg in South Africa. And we've had other architects, renowned architects like Tom Main, Ken Frampton, Carme Pinos from Barcelona, join us in this, which is, together with the Pele Distinguished Visiting Lecture, are 2 platforms to invite guests, usually internationally, to come here and spend sometimes a semester, sometimes a whole year with us. They do a studio normally, and after that studio, they work on a publication, and that publication usually comes later and it's given away. Tonight we have the unique privilege that I think is the first time that a PLIM professor is going to do a lecture with the books already here. And those of you who are interested, Wanda is going to kindly sign and dedicate those books for you at the end of the lecture. So that's a possibility. I know many of you already know Wanda, because she was here. We're lucky that she spent a whole semester with us, but I'll say a few things. Wanda de la Costa holds a joint position at Arizona State University between the Design School as the Institute Professor and the School of Construction as Associate Professor. She's a member of the Saddle Lake First Nation and has spent nearly 20 years working with indigenous communities in North America. Her current work focuses on reoperationalizing indigenous ways of knowing, being, and connecting in contemporary architecture education and practice. Her interests include co-design methodologies, indigenous placekeeping, and climatic resiliency based on regional architectures. Dalla Costa was the first First Nation woman to become an architect in Canada and is part of a team of Indigenous architects representing Canada in the 2018 Venice Biennale. Dalla Costa's coursework at ASU includes Indigenous planning, architecture, and construction, and a multidisciplinary Indigenous construction studio where architecture, construction, and planning students work directly with tribal communities. It is an honor and a pleasure for us to share PLIM Auditorium with PLIM Professor Wanda Dalla Costa.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I think I'll just use my mic here. Great to be back. How many of you came on the plane last night from China? Oh, can we give these people a round of applause first? Because I'm guessing it's the middle of the night right now in China, isn't it? You guys are doing fantastic. So that was a random occurrence that I ended up meeting Brenda in the airport and reminiscing at our wonderful semester that we spent exploring Arizona, talking about Indigenous design. We had a really beautiful class. It was very international. And I'll share today, I want to share 3 things. And one of the things I want to share is what we did that semester and kind of what came out of it. But if anyone's ever saw any lectures that I've done, I rarely do the architecture thing, which you just flip through projects and talk about each project. I really love to talk about ideas. So this is the heart of our work, is just kind of thinking about ideas and what inspires architecture. So that's what I want to focus on today. I'll talk about the studio from 2022, but before that, I want to talk about the city from an Indigenous lens. But before that, I think it's important to preface this talk with some background in Indigenous imagination. So let's start with Indigenous imagination. So we all know what imagination is. Is anyone here not from architecture? Or are you all architecture? So we have a couple, but largely this is 98% full of architecture students here. And we all know that that's what we're aspiring to, is to build our imaginations, to build that muscle. And imagination, the definition, is that it is that gives us the capacity to think about what has not yet existed. And this is the realm that I live within. Indigenous design is a very new undertaking, and we have to kind of make it up as we go along. So imagination is a critical piece of this, and I constantly have to refresh my business to think about where are we going now? Where do we take this thing? Where do we move this thing? It's such a beautifully dynamic field. And I think the acceleration of innovation is something I'm really, really interested in, the acceleration of imagination. So we're going to look today at imagination through the city, through the lens of Indigenous design. So on the screen, hang on, there we go. So what we're doing at our firm is exploring the process in architecture. So we know that the product is going to be a result of the process. And so we're trying to explore, if we shift the process, where do we end up? The last book that I read was the book called Imagination Machine. It's by a fellow named Martin Reeves, and it was actually a business-driven book. I read a lot. I use Audible, so I can just plow through books, multiple books a week while I'm driving. But his point of view on imagination is that we need to increase the collusions with the world in order to drive the acceleration of ideas. What you're seeing on screen are from his book, and it's Walt Disney's formula, which is dream, diversify, and never miss an angle. The one on the right is 10 years later. And he's basically trying to show how all of the various divisions of the production company work in concert, complementing one another. To the author, what's important for him is that the collusions arise, and that when we push ourselves into the world, we grow in understanding. And I'm sure your professors have talked to you about intendere, the Latin word which is about the root of intention. This is exactly what this is. And the folks that just came back from China yesterday, I'm guessing that when they were there were many things that sparked their imagination, that changed their perception, that brought them into a new world, because they were in a completely different place. In our firm, similarly, we have a lot of non-Indigenous staff now. For whatever reason, we cannot find enough Indigenous staff to work at our firm. So we have a firm in Calgary, Alberta, and one in Phoenix, Arizona. And about half of our firm is non-Indigenous. And it was, I would say, a bit of an experiment. I brought in a non-Indigenous faculty member, and we thought together and ideated together, and what came out of that was completely different than I would have thought of on my own. And it was that sort of collusion that he is talking about in the book. This is the model that comes out of that book. And what he's talking about in the book, and I think it's really relevant here, it's definitely relevant to what we do at the firm, is that something needs to trigger or inspire imagination, to take us out of the normal way of looking at things, and enable us to refocus our perception, refocus our attention, and change the mental filters through which we see the world. He cites in that book 3 triggers for imagination: accidents, anomalies, and analogies. To him, he says that accidents are the incidents that are irrelevant of what we're trying to achieve. Anomalies are parts of a situation, story, or data set that are out of the ordinary. And analogies are the parallels that we draw between concepts that can suggest entirely new possibilities. So the class that just returned from China, once they get a little bit of sleep, I'm sure they all have shifted their perception in some way based on that trip. This weekend, as I was preparing for this talk, I was trying to think about how these 3 things, accidents, anomalies, and analogies, have come into the work that we do at the firm. And I share with you, we have an open book process on our design methodology. We have a design research firm. It's not strictly a design firm, it's a design research firm, and this is our very elaborated process. We won't go through all the details, but I bring it to share with you that we have, instead of just thinking about design, which is the circle that you see in orange, we added a whole whack of steps to our process, as well as steps on the back called storytelling, because we are actively looking for accidents in this process. And we built it based on trying to collude with the world. So through this process, we have engagement, we have place-based research. What we're doing is we're seeking out external design influences. We have also, in this process, built in a feedback loop that we can measure success based on those outside influences. The Indigenous mind thinks about decision-making in a more collective and collaborative way. And what's challenging, I think, to the field of architecture, when I was in school, it was the 90s, it was a long time ago, but it was really about the architect and what he wanted to do, what he or she wanted to do. And I think the norms in Indigenous design cause it to flip and cause it to do something else. And there's a term in Indigenous methodologies called embracing social business. And what that essentially means is that we come together to make decisions together, to reach consensus, and we want to ensure that there's transparency for all the decisions. And as you can imagine, when I came to architecture school, this was pretty challenging, where I said, well, I need to talk to my community in order to actually make a decision on something. But for me, I think what this framework does, and it took about 30 years to get it to where it is right now. It's a living framework, and we constantly add a phase, take away a phase, whatever we need to do. But what it does is it offers a highly collaborative approach to design that aims to enlarge the community's role in the planning of both urban and rural environments. It also aims to increase authentic representation. Everybody has seen the cliches of Indigenous architecture with the teepees plastered on the side of the wall, or the symbols, you know, just sort of lipstick on the outside. We don't want that. We want authentic representation. This framework also tries to increase the functionality of the cultural spaces. You know, what does it mean to smudge inside of a healing room, inside of a school? And I think the other thing that this process does is it really starts to uplift those under-examined Indigenous worldviews and value systems, which I truly, truly believe are what is going to save us with all of the wicked issues that are facing this world. I think the answers lie in here. So just to kind of give you a very quick snapshot of the phases. Phase 1 on the far left is the Indigenous startup phase, and that's basically aligning with your clients, with the community, and setting expectations. The second phase, place-based research, is just personally, internally for us. We want to increase our cultural fluency before we go into a community, so we're not being surprised with concepts that come out. The third phase is engagement, which focuses on that dialogue, bringing those accidents and those anomalies and analogies up that uplift the local narratives. Phase 4 is the co-design or collaborative design. And then finally, the storytelling is about documenting all of the teachings and learnings into some sort of media format that we can give back to the community. But the point I wanted to make by bringing this and showing this is that this process is our trigger from start to finish. And the end goal of this is to increase the accidents and to bring productive disruption to the field of architecture. Through the norms, how you do it, what the end product is, we want to disrupt. So I'm going to talk, that was about the accident in our firm. I want to switch now to the anomalies that happen in our firm. And hopefully this is sparking some things for you of how you can take these accidents, anomalies, and analogies into your own practice. So as I shared before, anomaly is a part of a situation, story, or data set that's out of the ordinary. We were designing a house for the Gila River. It's up in the valley, or down in the valley in Phoenix. And the students, the architecture students, brought these designs to the client group, and they were so excited to talk about the form and the aesthetics. And the client, she said, I want to see a view, a 3D view, looking through the window to the outside. That's what I deeply care about. It went completely over the head. We all sat there kind of flabbergasted. She didn't really prioritize the form or the aesthetics. This was a bit of an awakening for us, right? It was kind of a shock. And so we started exploring from that, we started exploring the relationship between nature and humans from an Indigenous lens. And of course, there's a lot written on this, you can delve into it. But the bottom line is Indigenous people have a kinship relationship with nature. So nature isn't just like a thing out there that you can buy and trade and sell and occupy. It's really like a cousin. And so it's really difficult to imagine how you can buy and sell a mother or a father or a cousin or a brother. And so it's a completely different view of the world. There's a term in the Indigenous philosophy called ethical relationality. And that term is about all of the relations between all of those interrelated living things. So it's the stewardship of everything from people, animal, plants, mountains, water bodies, all of the things. And in that system, humans are not elevated above. They exist on the same plane as everything in there. So you can see how her mindset, when she wanted to look out the window, she was looking at family out there. And we were not focusing on that. So in our process, this is why we have to leave the time and the space for those narratives, to uplift those narratives. The storytelling continues to trigger us and inspire us and moves us out of that routine way of looking at things and allows us to refocus our perception and attention. The third example I bring are the analogies. So what you see on screen are a series of exploded axos that we are currently working on in our firm. As I mentioned, analogies are about the parallels that you see between concepts that can suggest new possibilities. And we find a lot of synergies in this work, but then in the case like this, we're trying to create some analogies, like what can we do to kind of like push this along? And so the aim in this one, we were looking for new tectonics that came from traditional architecture. We were looking at the materials being used. This was for a project up in Calgary, Alberta. And then we were looking at those deep connections to place. We were hoping, like, what are we going to find something really new and innovative? And what this did, we sat in a collusion type room with a great big non-Indigenous firm and our Indigenous staff and some non-Indigenous staff. And it ended up, the building that's going to be released at the end of this year looks nothing like any performing arts center that I think I've ever seen. It looks like a lodge, a mashup and a mix-up of many of the things that you see on screen. So these are the things that we interrogate. We have a weekly, what we call a design den. It's every Wednesday we get together and try and like bring our brains together and create these collusions. And this is the one that's hot on our mind right now. So just to give you a bit of a summary, the accidents, anomalies, and analogies, those are the things that trigger us or attempt to trigger us in our firm. Going back to that author of the book, that's his book there, The Imagination Machine. And again, it's a business book. I always try to find ways to how do I continue to inspire and incite the people that work in our firm. And he tells us also that it's not just about the 3 A's, but he said there's a mental context that is equally important for the imagination. And he says we have to notice and we have to care. And he shares that the ability to both notice and to care is instigated by 2 more things: aggravations and aspirations. So now we've got 5 A's to remember. But the aggravations drive us to want to change or escape something, whereas the aspiration drive us to bring something that we want or believe into being. I am standing here in front of you because I was aggravated by architecture school. It's so funny when I have to tell this story to a room full of architects, but it really is, it was such an important part of this journey that I'll share it with you. So 1997, I enter architecture school. The modernist agenda was in full swing, and I had just returned from 7 years backpacking. So for all of you that just came back from China, I did that for 7 years and filled my brain with the craziest things that you can imagine. And so when I got back from that journey, I hit about 40 countries or so, and I was also living deeply in many places. I lived in, India and Israel and, Australia, all these places around the world. And the architecture that I saw overseas before I entered an architecture school was very expressive and was very connective to the place. So when I got to architecture school, I had to conform to the abstraction that is the modernism movement that I was part of, but there was always a disconnect between expression and abstraction, and modernism and tradition that was present then and still is present for me now. And all I could think of while I was in architecture school, my aspiration, was how I bring that richness that I saw on that journey back home to North America to make visible the parts of our indigenous cultures that have become invisible. And there's so many things that we try and connect to. Systems, like what are organizational systems, value systems, knowledge systems. We try and create value systems. They are so beautifully powerful. The ones I just gave you, ethical relationality, that's a value system. And of course, social organization, everyone knows the concept of elder. They're like a moral compass for everything that we do. They always guide our meetings, and they kind of keep you on track at remembering what the important aspects of what we're all gathered here for are. They're really beautiful watchdogs and our moral compass. And so I want to share with you stories from my travels just to give you an idea of how that would have changed my mind, and hopefully the people who are come back from China can also start to see, and I'm sure many of you have also traveled to other phenomenal places, can also start to see how this inspires our imaginations. So on the left-hand side, you see a picture of India, and I was in the north where the Tibetan communities live, and they have this beautiful practice of leaving markers in the landscape. The flags that they plant on these pilgrimage trails are visible reminders of their belief system. And then I thought to myself, well, Indigenous people, we also have markers in the landscape. We have stone circles that indicate the coming of summer solstice. We have carvings, on the rocks that you go by on the rock carvings that are serving other travelers who are coming to warn them. And we also have flags that we leave after our ceremonies. In the middle is the Dalai Lama, and I was next in Nepal. And I went to see the Dalai Lama's doctor, who was free. Even a broke backpacker that didn't speak the language, the Nepalese language, could go and see him. We didn't speak the same language, but it didn't matter because he uses pressure points to treat you. And so he could tell, he did his pressure point test on me, and he could tell that my knees were aching from hiking 10 days in the Himalayas. And he gave me these little brown pills that, I don't know what they were, but I was supposed to mix them with hot water and drink them every night, and so I did, and sure enough, the pain went away. Then I thought, wait, this is traditional knowledge. This is Nepalese traditional knowledge. And I was like, we have traditional knowledge systems at home, and we also use natural. Remember Mom making me chew on all sorts of crazy things when we were little, bark root and grass root and all these things? Those were her natural remedies for healing. The third instance I bring, I was in Israel, and I actually had the very fortunate, I was living in a Jewish household at the time, and the grandfather was a rabbi, and it was a very traditional household. And I was reading a book one day, and I had folded a corner of the book, and he noticed that, and he said, oh, don't fold the book, it's sacred, don't harm the book. And he knew I was very interested in what he was going on about, and so I said, can you tell me more, tell me more. And he continued to share all these stories from the Bible, which were so interesting because they were filled, just like our stories back home, with ethics, values, meaning. And so it's crazy that these experiences, just a sample of how this shifted my mind and my perception, and it gave me a different lens to look at the world through, but it also served to validate my own culture. And so here I was in architecture school that was driven by modernism and encouraging me to abandon not only my culture, but every other culture that I had just spent 7 years being just fascinated with, absolutely fascinated with. So I know now that it wasn't the school, the professors, it was an era, and it was sparked by someone's interest in efficiency, the modernism movement, which permeated quickly around the globe, and it had to reject tradition. And with it, it rejected the long-established and deep-rooted modes of living and acting that tradition represents. So in that era that I was in architecture school, imagine that, I basically had to zip it in architecture school and not say anything, but tradition was seen as a hindrance. Indigenous design was even worse. It was associated with vernacular architecture, which of course back in the day was very much the less than all the, compared it to the bright and shiny newness that architecture constantly reinvents itself. And against that, it was impossible to compete. So I conceded, and I did what I had to do to get through architecture school. When I started digging into how the modernist movement came about, I had to dig into this, and I had to understand, where did this come from? And so, I don't know if you have read and studied the Futurist Manifesto by Maronati. It's a long time ago, 1909. But it was basically an outspoken condemnation of the accumulated knowledge, learning, and wisdom that had been handed down from past generations. I mean, we know better now. This was, the mood of the times. But there's a lot of residue, I find, that I think we're pushing through now. We're past it now. But during my first 20 years in architecture, I was haunted by this, and like kind of an outsider, But what I also want to say is that this view, I think, pushed us into a very abstracted view of architecture, and it almost kind of detaches from the humans that live in the architecture, that occupy the architecture, that eat, sleep, breathe, work, study, gather in these places. And so I've been always trying to push an architecture that is very human-based. Some of the inspiration that has come to me over the years, this is there's many great thinkers. I mean, some of the former Plym professors were some of the early doctrines that I would read and be absolutely in love with, but Balkrishna Doshi is one of those thinkers that I absolutely love. And the book that I was reading last was called Design Roots. And one of the premises of that book was about uplifting tradition. And this is, again, a really hard struggle in architecture. But the author in that book, Design Roots, was speaking to the era of modernism design, and he says that it actually caused its own demise. That modernism caused its own demise. The push for sameness all around the world unexpectedly and paradoxically fueled our appetite for the traditional and sense of place associated with culturally significant design, products, and practices. Tradition is a collaborative, multi-generational enterprise that satisfies the human impulse to preserve what is valued. It preserves what is valued. And the quote that you see on screen, I couldn't help but taking it word for word to share with you, because he was speaking about the pre-industrial environmental and human connection, which just thrills me. But he was talking about how much richer it was back in the day, everything from the climate to the materiality to the ability for it to accommodate socio-cultural rituals. So I had both the aggravation, the love of culture that I came into architecture school with. It was being challenged, but I also had the aspiration. I wanted to come home to see if I could develop a process that would uplift imagination and draw from traditional cultures. So before we move to the next section, talking about the city, I'm going to weave all of these views into the talk about the city. I'll just summarize a little bit. So we're talking here about imagination, the capacity to explore what is not in existence yet. The IPKF swirl, the Indigenous Placekeeping Framework, the swirl that I showed you, that diagram, provides us the room for the accidents, the narratives, and the stories. That brick house that we're designing for that group, it was an anomaly that reminds us that our priorities as architects were misaligned with the people that we were serving. And the exploded axos are also a trigger that help foster analogies pushing us toward new ways of looking at the world. All right, let's talk about the city. So I don't know how many of you know this, but a lot of Indigenous people now live in the city. My mom, she moved off the res, she went to residential boarding school, and then she went into the city because that's what she was kind of trained to do. And a lot of people from that generation ended up going to the city. And so we were all raised in the city, going out to the res, which we call the farm, every weekend to hang out with our cousins, which was the most fun place on earth. There's no running water, and we were riding horses and just hundreds and hundreds of cousins. It was literally the best place to be. But right now, 60% of Indigenous people worldwide live in cities. In the US, 72% live in cities now. So as city planners and designers are now tasked to align with shifting currents of the times, Indigenous people are also at the same time in the process of trying to understand what is their place amidst this shift. And these shifts that are occurring in our cities, I mean, look at the demographic shift that's happening in the US as well with, the majority, the US will be a majority minority country by 2050. These are major shifts. And so when you think about that alongside all the wicked issues happening in our world, I can kind of see why there's an increasing interest in the pluriverse, new perspectives from many, many different places. And I think they give us an opportunity when we start to study them, like we are trying to study them. They provide an opportunity to reframe our understanding of urban living and enable us to reimagine the city as a site of advocacy, dialogue, and participation. The term radical reinventions also came from the book Design Roots, and I thought it fitting when we talk about the city, because the city is really being shifted as we speak, and I'll share a few ways that we are seeing and hearing and partaking in the shift. On screen is some of our architecture works. Most of those, yes, I think all of those are actually in the city. And the term radical reinventions are initiatives which aim to bring new life to culturally significant designs, products, or practices, and even enhance the values associated. So if you think about a radical reinvention, I guess the buildings could be, it's about rethinking artifacts is what they're trying to do. In my field, that's buildings, but I think it could be all the way down to products. It could also be about rethinking inspirations, using patterns in new ways or forms in new contexts. What about new uses for traditional craft products? Rethinking the production process, such as our Indigenous placekeeping framework. Even the business model behind the design practice, I think that can also be a radical reinvention. Our firm is pretty loose. We have dogs and kids running around during the day. We have, flex days. There's so many interventions. We even have a 5-year-old kid that's coming to the office now, and we just let it all kind of happen because I want our firm not to be that sort of, place where people feel really, uncomfortable. I want it to feel like home. And so we've purposely radically reinvented what the firm feels like. But we're not the only ones reinventing. Te Aranga, we studied, this is one of the things we studied when we were talking with the students back in 2022 of the studio. The Maori people in New Zealand, alongside urban leaders, have radically reinvented the urban scale of Auckland. They built a set of urban design principles based in Indigenous value systems. They're outcome-based, which means they have a way to, produce outcomes within the city. They're embedded within the policy of the City of Auckland. And they provide practical guidance for enhancing outcomes, not just for Indigenous people, but it's for all people. And to me, look at that. Who wouldn't want to live in a city that is guided by ethics like this? I would like to live in that city. And this is one of the exercises we do in our design research class. We reimagine Phoenix, where we live, based on different value system, and it kind of shifts your brain as well. So in this case, you see how a city can actually be home to a radical reinvention as well. We brought those principles to the 2022 PLIM studio, And we did it with the help of 3 artists, 3 Indigenous artists. So this was part of our praxis of how we begin to kind of think about bringing theory, meshing it with applied work. And so through a grant, I got an NEA Our Town grant. And it funded 3 Indigenous artists to go back into their home communities. You know, there's 3 local Indigenous communities right around Phoenix. And I said, go back to your home communities, do some listening sessions, talk to the people, and see if you can create ta'aranga for Phoenix. I leave it completely up to you. I don't want to interfere. I'm Cree from way up north. Anyway, I'm an outsider. You guys go take it on and tell me what you find. And so these think tank sessions that they did ended up creating these urban design principles, which you see on screen. But it also created a collective. These 3 artists formed a little collective called Hekiu, which is an artist continuum that was supposed to help developers, architects, and planners work through these difficult sort of place-based design issues in the city. All right, the last example before we get into the PLIM studio, and then I'll stop for questions, is the last urban planning initiative. This just came to us last week, and I'm so excited. This is another approach to city reimagining. So remember I said we had the expanded design den, or the Indigenous design den every Wednesday, where we have this kind of think tank, but monthly we invite external guests to come in and help us think and help us kind of create collusions. And we had a Harvard grad, Grant Fulgren. He's a planner, and he was talking to us about cities not built by grids, but built according to traditional clan territories and their natural ecologies. The intent of the Terranomics plan was to move from the idea of the value of land to land-based values. In his thesis, he talks about the colonial city, the economic logic that informed decision-making based on property rights and individual ownership. For Grant, who's an Anishinaabe man from Toronto, also known as Tikaronto, he said that the city planners didn't think about his kinship relatives, those who inhabit the city, the animals who inhabit the city. Not only the animals, but the water and plants. And he aspired to change. So he was, again, I think, a little aggravated that his kinship group was excluded, and he aspired to change. His 7-generation plan challenged the existing economic logics and included restoration of clan animal habitats as guiding principles for urban development. His thesis is available online, and I can't even do it justice. It's so phenomenal, but I'll show you what his end product looked like. So again, this is an Indigenous planner. So on the left, you see the original Toronto plan based on grids and so forth. He took out the places where the animals live to create these ecological habitats in the city of Toronto. I mean, he's very far, far ahead in terms of his thinking, but I think it's really provocative. So I leave you with a couple of projects before we get into the last section, the little bit, I'll chat about the PLIM studio, but I wanted to share with you a couple of our projects. Again, I don't talk typically about our architecture because it's all on our website. You can go and see, and we have a lot of good descriptions about it. But I want to show to you what our urban Indigenous architecture looks like. And when I think about Grant's grand plan, I brought 2 projects from within that Toronto region to show you that if you imagine planning as a radical reinvention, can we imagine architecture also as a radical reinvention? And so what you see in the middle is what we call our Indigenous design triad. This is our metric of success, and it comes from Amos Rappaport. He did a lot of really amazing studies on the connection between people and their environments. And of course, he used very academic terms, but I sort of chose very user-friendly terms to be able to define a metric for how we do architecture. So for instance, in this picture, this is for Western University in London, Ontario. We believe that city spaces need to host cultural lifeways. So for Indigenous people, that can mean round dances or feasting, cooking, a bunch of students cooking a roast together, storytelling, the picture on the lower left, or having a ceremony in that arbor that sits outside. That we dug into the earth to go down into the lower level. There wasn't enough light in that lower level for the students, but we also wanted to build a traditional garden. Again, bringing the lifeways into the city, bringing the knowledges into the city, the worldview. And the identity, all of the marks that you see in there, from the symbols on the shade structure to the room dividers, everything has a meaning. Everything has an absolutely embedded meaning. These are the terms that Amos Rappaport used: social, behavioral, and ideological, to describe what I just shared as the triad. And this is a project that we did just across from the Parliament in Ontario. And again, you know, it's easy to see now, I think, the lifeways. You can see all the places to gather that we embedded. In terms of the worldview, there is it's hard to tell, but the fire that you see on the right-hand side, fire is a connective idea that signifies honesty and truth-telling, and that fire is positioned directly across from the Canadian Parliament. And in terms of identity, if you see the shawl that wraps that building, and you see all the little feathers or snowshoes on there, those were supposed to be, customized by every First Nation across Canada. So their identity would be baked into this building, and reminding the Canadian government that there are many Indigenous people, and they are still here, and this is the home that they will occupy. This, of course, wasn't going to get built. This was a scoping exercise, and we created our great big design report, and we handed it off to the big international firm that will try and make that piece of parcel work. But I'm sure the building will look nothing like this. But it was very fun to create this. I should also say that underneath the glass dome was a traditional piece of architecture that they gave us to design this Indigenous embassy across from the Parliament. So there were 3 Indigenous architects coming together on this project, and we literally thought, what a conundrum. We have a colonial piece of architecture, and we're supposed to create Indigenous design out of it. It was like a crisis, but so we decided to wrap the thing up in something that reflected our identity a bit more. All right, let's get to the last part, which is the Plim Studio. So I don't have too much to share with you. As you know, it's all documented in the publication that is in front of you. But I wanted to point out 3 things that were really critical as part of this work. So, and what I think triggered or inspired or hopefully set a new course for the students who took the studio. On the left-hand side, you see a definition of Indigenous architecture by Hirini Matunga. He's a New Zealand scholar. He's actually a planner, but he came out with a theory in architecture, and I said, well, let's take it for a test drive. And the 7 words in the middle of the circle are his 7-category definition that Indigenous architecture should embody. And the spokes coming out, radiating out, are ideas that we connected to along this pathway. In the middle, that's Hekio. Those are the 3 Indigenous artists that were creating the Indigenous principles for the city as we were working through our studio that year. And again, they would pop in and out of class and join us, and we would collude and ideate with them. It was a really fun semester. And then finally, to spark even further imagination, because we're very interested in metrics, like how are we judging architecture? Is it because, 8 people sit in a room and decide something's beautiful? Is there nothing else that we can actually judge architecture from? And so I said, let me get something the most holistic sort of metric that I can find. And there's a gal who is teaching at ASU, Elizabeth Castillo, and she works in the field of social accounting metrics. And so those icons that you see on the right, and I apologize if they're difficult to read, she wants to expand our metrics for the city away from aesthetics and economics to incorporate everything from the human, the relational, the symbolic, the structural, the natural, and the financial. And so I think what it does is this system enables intangible assets, including social, cultural, spiritual, and all of those to exist alongside human and natural capabilities. So I think this is a really kind of expansive idea for us. How are we basing metrics of architecture? And so this work is ongoing. So, and finally, I'm guessing the picture of the site tour is going to take a bit to load here. There we go. And these are some of the site tours that we did that tour, and I think we hopefully inspired the students in the best possible way. We hit Arco Santi, we saw the beautiful nature, the desert, such a powerful environment. we ate and, you know, colluded with all of the Arco Santi architecture students who have moved from Taliesin West, who now occupy Arco Santi. And we did a number of tours of traditional architecture, of the Huhugam Heritage Center. We were absolutely hosted in the most beautiful way. So it was just a really wonderful semester, and I thank you, and especially to Mark for joining us and kind of leading the troops through a really, really phenomenal and fun semester. So with that, I want to thank everyone and just really leave you with the thought of how do we inspire our imagination? How can we kind of open up our brains to accidents, anomalies, and analogies, as well as aggravations and aspirations, in order to increase imagination toward bringing radical reinventions to our architecture? Thank you.